Hello, I'm Katja Klussmann and this presentation is for PSYC 820. Today I want to talk with you about something I find absolutely fascinating, spiritual bypassing. It's one of those topics that sits right at the crossroad of psychology and theology. And honestly, once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. So here's an overview. We will start with what psychologists have discovered about spiritual bypassing. Then we will look at what the Bible actually says about the same patterns. After that, I want to introduce you to a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian named Kierkegaard, who somehow managed to describe all of this before modern psychology even existed. And finally, we will talk about why any of this matters for real life and where research still needs to go. You have seen spiritual bypassing without maybe knowing you did. For example, you know someone who is struggling with serious depression, and when you suggest therapy, they say, "No, I'll just pray about it." Or there is that person who every single time you try to have a difficult conversation, they quote scripture and shut it down. Or maybe, and this is very popular right now, you tell yourself you are setting boundaries to guard your heart, but really, you just don't want to deal with the conflict. None of these are signs of deep faith. They are actually examples of spiritual bypassing. And here's what's wild. Kierkegaard was calling this out many years ago. He called it Christendom. People who looked Christian on the outside but were avoiding the real messy, costly work of authentic faith. So what is spiritual bypassing exactly? Cashwell and his team defined it in 2007 as using spiritual beliefs or practices to avoid dealing with psychological pain or emotional difficulties. And research shows it has two parts. First, psychological avoidance, that is using spirituality to sidestep uncomfortable feelings. Second, spiritualizing, applying spiritual explanations to everything in ways that actually prevent you from solving real problems. Now, here is an important distinction. Not all religious coping is bypassing. Honest faith can be incredibly good for your mental health. But bypassing, that's different. It's defensive. It's using God talk to avoid doing the hard inner work. In 2017, Fox and his team created the spiritual bypass scale, and they have tested it in Brazil, in India, Korea, Spain, Honduras, and all over the world. Every time they found the same two-factor structure. That tells us something important. It is not only an American evangelical thing or something Western cultural thing, but it is a universal human tendency. The way it shows up might look different in different places. Spiritual language in Korea sounds different than in Brazil. But that underlying pattern of using religion to avoid pain, that is everywhere. We are dealing with something deeply human here. So what actually happens to people who spiritual bypass? Unfortunately, the research is pretty clear and it is not too encouraging. First, people show higher anxiety, depression, and overall psychological distress. One would think turning to spiritual activities would help, right? But in some cases it doesn't. Fox and Picciotto found in 2019 that spiritual bypassing actually makes the relationship between stress and mental health worse. Second, people show lower mindfulness. They are less present with what is actually happening because they are constantly reframing everything through spiritual language. And third, this one really concerns me. Spiritual bypassing significantly reduces people's willingness to get professional help. Here's the paradox. People use bypassing to escape pain, but it actually amplifies their pain and keeps them from getting the help that could truly make a difference. So why does it backfire? It comes down to something called experiential avoidance. Basically trying to escape painful internal experiences even when avoiding them actually makes things worse long term. For example, a painful emotion shows up. The person immediately reaches for spiritual language to make it disappear. Maybe they quote a verse, pray for God to remove the feeling. And sure, short term, they might feel some relief, but the emotion does not actually go away. It just gets shoved down. And when it comes back, and it always does, it sometimes comes back stronger. So they need even more spiritual bypassing to cope. Dworsky's 2016 research found this. Experiential avoidance is the key mechanism. Spiritual bypassing is essentially weaponizing faith as an emotional escape hatch. And it just does not work. Okay, so psychology tells us this is harmful. But what does the Bible say? Does Scripture address any of this? Absolutely. Jesus himself confronted this exact pattern. Now the Bible does not use the phrase spiritual bypassing. That is our modern psychological term. But Scripture repeatedly describes and condemns using outward religious behavior to cover up inward avoidance. After reviewing this, I found that Scripture has several names for what we now call spiritual bypassing. First, hypocrisy. Jesus calls the Pharisees whitewashed tombs in Matthew 23, beautiful on the outside, full of death inside. They are using religious performance to avoid real inner transformation. Second, hardness of heart, refusing to actually respond to God while keeping up religious appearances. Third, self-deception. James warns about hearing the word but not doing it, which is fooling ourselves about where we really stand spiritually. 1 John says, if we claim we are without sin, we are deceiving ourselves. That is actually what spiritual bypassing does. It lets us think we are spiritually mature when we are actually avoiding the real work. And fourth, idolatry. We usually think of that as worshipping false gods, but Scripture also describes it as trusting in or elevating anything above God, including religious performance itself. So what does Scripture give us instead? First, lament. The Psalms are full of raw, honest, messy expressions of pain. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? That's very raw. That's gut-level honesty with God. Second, emotional honesty. Think about Jesus in Gethsemane. He did not spiritually bypass his fear of the cross. He brought it straight to the Father. Third, confession. Admitting reality instead of covering it up with the spiritual language. Fourth, humility. I need help. I can't do this alone. And finally, wholehearted devotion, an undivided heart where your outer spirituality and inner reality actually match. If there's one overall biblical theme here, it is this. God cares about inner transformation, true change, and not just outward performance. Isaiah chapter 29 verse 13, which Jesus also quotes, says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." So God desires truth in the inward being, not just right behavior, but actual internal reality that matches what we are showing externally. Spiritual bypassing lets us keep up religious activity while at the same time avoiding the very thing God is after, an honest transformation at our core. Now let me introduce you to the person who really ties all this together. Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher and theologian. He spent much of his life talking about what he called Christendom, people who were Christians in name only. They had figured out how to be comfortable with Christianity, how to fit into their lives without actually changing. They were, in his words, avoiding existence, and they were using religious identity as an escape from the anxiety and responsibility of actually becoming a self before God. Kierkegaard was describing spiritual bypassing years before psychologists gave it a name. His line, "Purity of heart is to will one thing," captures us perfectly. Authentic faith requires an undivided self. In Sickness unto Death, Kierkegaard defines the self as a relation that relates itself to itself, and in relating itself to itself, relates itself to another. Okay, I have to admit, I read that page so many times and I thought about it for hours, and I made a little graphic which you see on the slide, and you might want to think about it and just look at it, but I had to think a lot about what he meant and how to put all this together. And I do not have time to explain this here, but what it means is, I think you're fundamentally relational. You have a relationship with yourself, but that self-relationship is grounded in your relationship with God. Authentic selfhood means accepting yourself as you actually are before God. Spiritual bypassing is the opposite. It is refusing to accept your real condition, using religious language to construct a false self that looks more spiritual than you actually are. And this is what Kierkegaard calls despair, a misrelation of the self. Okay, here's the contrast. Despair refuses your actual condition. Faith accepts your reality before God. Despair uses religion defensively. Faith brings your struggles honestly to God. Despair avoids transformation. Faith embraces costly discipleship, the kind of Bonhoeffer talked about. Despair creates a divided self. Faith produces integrated selfhood. Despair settles for comfortable Christendom. Faith pursues the real hard work of following Jesus. Can you see how perfectly this maps onto spiritual bypassing? Psychology describes the behavior. Kierkegaard explains the theology underneath it. When we bring psychology and theology together, they are actually describing the same phenomenon from different angles. Psychology identifies spiritual bypassing as experiential avoidance that, interestingly, makes distress worse. Theology identifies it as hypocrisy, hardness of heart, despair, refusing to be honest before God. Neither perspective alone gives us the complete picture. Psychology shows us what is happening and what harm it causes. Theology shows us why it's happening. We are falling beings prone to self-deception, and what God actually wants instead is honest, costly, transformative faith. Kierkegaard describes spiritual bypassing as both a psychological defense mechanism and a theological misrelation of the self before God. So why does any of this matter in real life? First, we need to learn to recognize spiritual bypassing. When someone consistently answers every difficult emotions with a Bible verse or refuses professional help because prayer should be enough, those are red flags. Second, we need to provide holistic care that addresses both the psychological and spiritual dimensions. Someone with clinical depression needs professional treatment. They might also need to unpack why they are being taught that feeling sad means they lack faith. Third, encourage biblical practices that actually counter bypassing. Honest lament, real confession, prayer that brings actual emotions to God instead of pretending they do not exist. And fourth, this is very important, don't collude with the bypassing. When someone's avoiding grief, Don't comfort them with God has a plan. Sit with them in the pain. When someone spiritualizes their anxiety, help them get professional help. There are still gaps in our understanding. First, we need studies done over time. Does bypassing change as people mature spiritually? Does it spike during crisis? And so on. Second, we need interventions research. Does counseling help? Spiritual reaction. We literally have no empirical evidence about what actually works. Third, we need research on virtue and moral psychology. Can we measure growth in humility or wisdom? How does bypass mess with virtue formation? Fourth, we need cultural and contextual research across different denominations and specific populations. And fifth, we need to study digital spirituality, especially that social media might be amplifying bypassing through pressure to perform some ideal spiritual life online. Let me close this. Spiritual bypassing uses religious language to avoid emotional pain. Research shows it makes mental health worse and keeps people from seeking help and creates these cycles of avoidance. Scripture condemns these same patterns and calls us toward lament, confession, and wholehearted devotion. Kierkegaard describes spiritual bypassing as despair, a fundamental misrelation of the self before God. Understanding this requires both empirical research and theological depth. Moving forward, it means honest engagement with reality before God. It means bringing our pain, our doubts, our struggles into God's presence instead of hiding them with spiritual language. It means embracing costly discipleship instead of settling for comfortable Christendom. It means becoming the self God created us to be, fully known, fully loved, and truly transformed. Here are the references for this presentation. Thank you for watching.